This past summer, I had the opportunity to go back to Central Virginia and to visit 2 of the 4 churches that my husband and I co-pastored right after we graduated from seminary 30 years ago. One of those churches, a church that sits in the middle of rolling dairy farmland, is called Kirk-a-Cliff. Kirk is the Scottish word for church, and a cliff indicates that this little red brick church once stood on a cliff overlooking a river, but was moved brick by mule teams back in the late 19th century to its present location. I have a special place in my heart for this church because its members were some of the finest saints I have ever known on earth. Some 33 members strong when I served it. This church may have been small in numbers, but it was mighty in the things that matter in Christian faith, hope, and love. There was in this church an elder named Sam, a dairy farmer, who immediately greeted me after I arrived and offered to take me riding around in the community in his pickup truck to visit everyone who was unchurched. For Sam, the best thing he could offer people was his faith. This was a church in which a young woman who had been born with cleft palate and had multiple surgeries to correct this felt the call to go into a preaching ministry. And this church, rather than discouraging, prayed for her, supported her, and is proud as punch that she's now pastoring a little country church of her own. This was the church who, when they found out that I, their very first woman pastor, was also pregnant, approached me immediately after the service, delighted, and the first thing someone said to me was, "Hooray, we'll have a real live baby Jesus for the Christmas pageant this year." For in this church, they didn't care if baby Jesus wailed through the whole service, literally spit up on Mary. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and that was all that mattered. And so, this was the church where my husband and I had our 2 children, who were born during our tenure there, baptized. This church loved children, welcoming them with open arms. You can imagine then that going back some 25 years after I had left that place was a trip down memory lane. And of course, the first thing I noticed were all the things that had changed. The big old stove that used to sit right up front near the pulpit in that church and would draw people toward the front on cold winter days is no longer there. They have central heat now. The church now boasts 2 red brick buildings on its property. One that looks just like the little toy churches you see on Christmas cards covered in snow, red bricks, green pointed roof. That's the old sanctuary. The other now an educational building. And the tombstones in the cemetery beside the church now bear the names of many saints I knew, including all 3 of the dairy farmers who were elders there when I served that church. But some things are still the same. And one of them is that the little white house right across the street from the church, where the widow in today's gospel reading lives, is still there. I say she is the widow in today's gospel reading because I never hear that text from Mark read that I don't think about Allie Raines. Allie Raines was well into her 80s when I first became her pastor, and her life had been hard. Married for years to a man who was physically abusive and had now died, she had the sole care for her 2 grown adult sons who were both mentally and physically disabled. She had very little in terms of this world's good, living only on Social Security, and I'm sure she lived in that little house on Sam's dairy farm, rent-free. She couldn't get out to church herself, but every first Sunday of the month, like clockwork, she would send one of those sons across the street to make her offering. Often it was Gene, a grown man with a childlike love of tractors, who would drag his bad foot down the aisle with Allie Raines' offering envelope in hand to place her few dollars, most of what she had to live on, in the offering plate. After church on communion Sundays, I would always go see Mrs. Rain taking her communion, and she never let me go without also feeding me. She would take me back to the kitchen, where she had a bit of baked chicken, some green beans a neighbor had given, and always sweet tea, a Southern staple. And she would insist that I eat. I hated to eat her food because I knew how little she had. But what I learned from Allie Raines was when you have little, there is great joy in giving. And that was one thing she could still do. In the gospel reading today from Mark, Jesus encounters a widow who loved to give as much as Allie Raines. She didn't have much either, only 2 copper coins, which equaled about a penny, and yet she clearly had great faith. Who knows what hardship she had endured in her life? Who knows how she survived in that day since her husband, the sole source of support for her, had died? Who knows how she got along in that very patriarchal culture where women had few rights? But she, like Allie Raines, loved God and loved to give. And so in this great act of devotion, she goes to the temple in Jerusalem and goes up to one of those 13 trumpet-shaped vessels where they would collect the offerings of pilgrims coming to worship there, and she puts her 2 coins in. Can you hear them zinging down the walls until they drop at the bottom? I'm guessing she alone could hear it, but Jesus saw her. Not only does he see her, he lifts her up as a model of faith and faithfulness for his disciples. See that woman, that widow, he says to them. She has given more than anybody else in this place put together. They, out of their abundance, gave, but she has given her all. I think it's helpful to remember what Jesus had been doing when he encountered this widow, for he had already had quite a long and trying day. I'm guessing he had spent the first part of that day in the court of the Israelites, where only Jewish men were allowed to go, listening and answering the questions of the scribes. And man, did they have questions for him. Questions about the nature of his authority, questions about the nature of the resurrection, questions about whether or not they should pay taxes to Caesar, questions about which was the first and greatest commandment, questions about how the Messiah can be David's son. It was at the end of this long and grueling period of questioning that Jesus invites his disciples to go with him down the 12 steps that separate the court of the Israelites from the court of the women, and to go to that place where the women and the lepers and others considered unclean in that society went for worship. And it was there, in that lower court, that Jesus notices the widow and lifts her up as an example for us to emulate. The church through the years has loved this story and especially likes to pull it out this time of year, which in many churches is stewardship season, and to encourage all of us to give as sacrificially as the widow did. But you know what's remarkable to me about this story is how Jesus sees her. Picture who was in the temple that day: the priests making their burnt offerings on the altars, the scribes asking their questions and running around in their long robes, all sorts of other worshipers putting their bigger coins that clanged down that jar in the temple treasury. The disciples worried that Jesus' answers to the scribe questions are going to get him in even more trouble. And somehow in the midst of all that, Jesus sees this widow, sees her faith, sees her faithfulness, and lifts her up for us all. I don't know about you, but I sometimes find it hard to find the widows in our society or to see them because they don't draw a lot of attention to themselves. Rather than hanging out with us better educated types, they're often behind the scenes somewhere, sweeping the floor, emptying the trash, cooking our meals. But eventually I have come to see that they're always present. At the first seminary where I taught, the widow's name was Irene Jenkins. Once a week, regular as clockwork, Irene would come, knock on the door to my office, headphones clearly attached to her ears, dragging a vacuum cleaner behind her, asking if she could interrupt me long enough to vacuum the floor and empty the trash. For a long time, I didn't see Irene Jenkins because my head was buried in books and class preparations. But then one day, as she hummed her way around my office vacuuming, I looked up and I said, "Irene, tell me about yourself." And that's when I heard about her very hard life, about the husband who'd left her, the 2 boys she still cared for, her worries about one of them and whether he could stay out of prison this time. And then she started talking about her deep Pentecostal faith and how good the Lord had been to her in her life and what miracles she had witnessed. And I realized that Irene, like the widow, loved to give, and a part of how she gave was keeping those seminary buildings as clean as possible to prepare people for ministry in the church. At the last church where I served, Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York City, one of the big avenue churches, the widow's name was Laura. Laura was not immediately noticed by me either because she didn't serve on the officers' boards and she didn't come to a whole lot of church functions. But one Sunday after I preached a sermon on God and money, Laura came up and asked if she could come talk to me that week. That's when I found out that for Laura, money was a constant struggle. She was mentally disabled, could not hold a job, and lived in constant fear that she was going to be kicked out of her apartment and have to live on the streets. But oh my, did she love God, and did she love to give. "Reverend Nora," she would say, "I'd like to send you some of my artwork via email this week to brighten up your day, if you wouldn't mind." And I would get some of Laura's quirky artwork, and it would make me smile. Or at the end of a conversation about her life, she'd say, "Reverend Nora, if you don't mind, I'd like to pray for you too." And then Laura would launch into some of the most beautiful and eloquent and heartfelt and honest prayers with God I have ever heard. You see, I was battling cancer that year, and her gifts of art and prayer to me were as precious as the widow's mite. It can be hard to see the widow here at Yale. Faculty get noticed a lot. Administrators get noticed. Most students get noticed. But what about the people who clean our buildings, who cook and serve our meals, who keep our grounds looking beautiful? What about the people who bag our groceries at the store, who work on our cars, who serve our food at restaurants? Do we really see them like Jesus saw them? My daughter, Leonora, is one of those saints in life that my husband and I say we want to be more like when we grow up. She lives the faith we preach. And she's great at seeing people. Whenever I go to a restaurant with Leonora, she immediately notices the people serving her food and says, "Hey, how are you? How's your day going?" If she walks down the hall at the Divinity Schools with me and somebody's mopping the floor, she stops to thank them for their work. And one time when I was with her and a person approached her and said, "Can you spare me some change?" she reached deep in her pocket, pulled out $1 she keeps for just that purpose, handed it to the man, and then said, "What's your name and what's your story? Tell me about you." And after listening for a long, long time, she said, "You know, Mom, I think there are a lot of people around who just want somebody to know their name and listen to their story." She's right, I think. But that truth not only applies to our personal lives, it applies to how we see our nation's policies, too. Who do we see? Whose stories do we seek out when we're making our political decisions? Do we see the widow, or only those who talk longer and louder and are more prestigious than she? Sometimes I fear that this whole debate over health care reform in this nation depends a lot on where we're sitting when we think about such issues. Are we sitting in the upper court of the temple where those who have access to health care sit in their long robes and chat about what it's going to cost us? Or are we sitting in the court of the women where the people with chronic disease and the single parents of households are struggling to make ends meet and do not have health care. One of the things I love the most about that little country church I saw served was that it sees people like Jesus sees them. They saw those in the broader community in need of a church home and reached out. They saw children and welcomed them into their midst. They saw the poor and cared for them. But that's not all they saw. They also saw those who were getting the raw end of a justice system. In the late 1960s, the State Corporation Commission of Virginia came to that rural area of Virginia and condemned a lot of the land that lay around a lake because it wanted to build a cooling pool for its nuclear power plant. The elders in that little church, dairy farmers all, were understandably deeply disturbed by this. And they took the State Corporation Commission to court, but not just on their own behalf. They went around that neighborhood and found every single person who was living on a tiny plot of land who was going to be affected and who could not afford a lawyer and put them on their lawsuit so that they too could get justice. Who do you see in your daily life on this campus, in this city, in this community, and who do you fail to see? By his example, Jesus invites all of us to go to those places we might not ordinarily sit so that we can see the widows. And if we will see them, truly see them like Jesus did, I have a feeling it will change our lives. And maybe it will also change our nation's policies. For those who have given so generously to God and to others, don't they deserve some generosity as well? Amen.